The dust-laden breeze whispered against Rosalind Foster's tear-stained cheeks as she stood before the charred remains of what was once her life. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory had taken everything from her again. Her second chance at happiness burned to cinders like the ranch house before her. The townspeople of Willow Creek hadn't minced words when she'd married Thomas. Fool, they'd called her. After what happened with Edward, she's trusting another man with her heart and future. Now, with Thomas 6 months dead and his gambling debts revealed, those same people watched her with pitying eyes that seemed to say, "We told you so." Rosalind wiped her face with the back of her hand, the rough cotton of her sleeve scratching against her sunburnt skin. At 26, she felt twice that age. Two husbands, one killed in a mining accident, the other by a bullet over cards and nothing to show for it but a burned homestead and a reputation as the town's most gullible widow. "Madam?" The voice came from behind her, deep and unfamiliar. She didn't turn right away. She'd had her fill of condolences and thinly veiled judgment. "Madam, I don't mean to intrude, but you shouldn't be out here alone." This time, Rosalind turned. A man sat atop a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by the brim of his worn Stetson. His clothes were trail-dusty but of good quality. A stranger, then. Small mercies. "I'm perfectly fine, sir," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Was my property." The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with eyes the color of the sky after a storm and a jawline that could have been carved from the nearby hills. "Forgive me for saying so, but standing alone at a burned-out homestead doesn't strike me as perfectly fine." His tone wasn't mocking, merely matter-of-fact. "Name's Kieran Anderson. I'm looking for work in these parts." Rosalind almost laughed. "Well, Mr. Anderson, you've found the one place in Willow Creek with no work to offer." His eyes traveled over the blackened timbers and scattered debris. "I see a lot that needs doing. Rebuilding, for one." "Rebuilding requires money, Mr. Anderson, which I don't have." "Call me Kieran," he said, then gestured to the east. "I passed a creek not far back. Good water, good grazing. You've still got land." "Madam, land can be worked." Rosalind felt a flicker of something dangerous hope. She quashed it immediately. "The bank is claiming this land for Thomas's debts. I have until the end of the month to clear out." "Thomas was your husband?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and unlike the platitudes she'd heard in town, his words carried genuine weight. "Thank you." She turned back toward the ruins. "If you're looking for work, try the Miller Ranch to the north. They're always short-handed." She expected to hear the sound of his horse retreating, but instead, his boots crunched in the dirt beside her. "I've got a proposition, Mrs. Foster. Rosalind Foster." "Mrs. Foster, I'm handy with tools, good with livestock, and I know a thing or two about legal matters. Let me help you contest the bank's claim. In return, I ask for a place to sleep and meals when you can manage them." Rosalind stared at him. "You don't know me, Mr. Anderson. Why would you offer such a thing?" His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons for wanting to see a bank get its comeuppance. The townspeople would call me a fool for trusting a stranger after everything," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Kieran removed his hat and ran a hand through his sun-streaked brown hair. His smile was slow and reached his eyes. "Then I'll be the next fool, Mrs. Foster. Sometimes it takes one to recognize another." For the first time in months, Rosalind felt the corners of her mouth turn upward. "Well then, Mr. Anderson, welcome to what's left of the Foster Ranch." She hadn't planned to trust again, but as they walked toward the small stable that had survived the fire, Rosalind couldn't help feeling that maybe, just maybe, This particular bit of foolishness might be worth the risk. The stable was modest but sturdy, a testament to Thomas's rare moments of practicality. Inside, two horses nickered softly, her own mare, Penny, and Thomas's gelding, which she hadn't had the heart to sell. "You've got good stock," Kieran remarked, running a practiced hand down the gelding's leg. "Strong, sound." "Thomas had an eye for horseflesh, if nothing else," Rosalind replied. She moved to a corner where a small trunk and bedroll lay. "I've been sleeping here since the fire, 2 nights ago. You can have the hayloft." Kieran nodded, his eyes scanning the interior. "When was the last time you ate?" The question caught her off guard. "I had some jerky this morning." Without another word, he reached into his saddlebag and produced a small package wrapped in butcher paper. "Venison. Shot it yesterday. There's a stream nearby, we could have a proper meal?" Rosalind hesitated only briefly before nodding. "There's a cooking pot in that crate." As dusk settled over the land, they sat by a small fire near the stream. The venison stew, simple as it was, tasted better than anything Rosalind had eaten in weeks. "Tell me about these debts," Kieran said after they'd eaten, his voice cutting through the crackling of the fire. Rosalind stared into the flames. "Thomas was a gambler. I knew that when I married him, but he swore he'd changed." She gave a bitter laugh. "Changed his methods, perhaps. He borrowed from the bank instead of card sharks. Mortgaged the ranch 3 times over without my knowledge." "That's not legal," Kieran said firmly. "Not without your signature. Try telling that to Vernon Watts at the Willow Creek Bank." According to him, women don't know enough about financial matters to question their husband's decisions. Kieran's jaw tightened. "When did your husband die?" 6 months ago. Shot in a saloon in Deadwood. By then, the money was gone, but I managed to keep making minimum payments to the bank by selling off livestock. Then 3 nights ago, the fire." She shook her head. "They're calling it an accident, but I know better." "You think someone set it?" "I think Vernon Watts got tired of waiting for his money," Rosalind said, her voice hard. "The fire started in the middle of the night. From the outside. No lightning, no storm." Kieran was silent for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "Banks don't typically resort to arson. Too risky. But if you're right, that gives us leverage." "Us?" she questioned, arching an eyebrow. "I said I'd help, didn't I?" He leaned forward. "First light tomorrow, we'll ride into town. I want to see these loan documents myself." Rosalind studied him. "You still haven't told me why you're really helping me, Mr. Anderson." His eyes met hers across the flames. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to have everything taken away by people who think they're above the law." She wanted to press further, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she asked, "Have you been in Dakota Territory long?" "Long enough to know my way around," he replied, then changed the subject. "What will you do if we can save the land?" Rosalind hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. "Rebuild, I suppose. Start over. Again." "Alone?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to consider. "I've learned the hard way that depending on others is a luxury I can't afford," she finally said. Kieran nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But accepting help isn't the same as dependency, Mrs. Foster." "Rosalind," she corrected, surprising herself. "If you're going to be my foolish champion, you might as well use my name." His smile in response was worth the momentary vulnerability. "Get some rest, Rosalind. Tomorrow, we start fighting back." That night, as she lay on her bedroll listening to the soft sounds of Kieran settling into the hayloft, Rosalind felt something she hadn't experienced since before Thomas died, a sliver of hope. Dangerous as it was, she decided to hold on to it, just for now. Morning came with dew, heavy grass, and bird song. Rosalind woke to find Kieran already up, tending to the horses. He'd built a small fire and had a pot of coffee brewing. "You're an early riser," she commented, accepting the tin cup he offered. "Old habits?" he replied. "I thought we'd ride into town after breakfast. The sooner we deal with the bank, the better." Rosalind nodded, though anxiety knotted in her stomach. She hadn't been to Willow Creek since Thomas's funeral, avoiding the pitying glances and whispered comments. Now she'd be returning with a stranger at her side, more fodder for the gossip mill. "I should warn you," she said as they saddled the horses. "Willow Creek isn't known for its hospitality toward newcomers, especially ones who associate with me." Kieran tightened his saddle girth and shot her a grin that transformed his features. "I've faced worse than small-town gossips, Rosalind." Something about the way he said it made her wonder exactly what or who he had faced before. The ride into town took just under an hour, the early summer sun warming their backs as they followed the winding dirt road. Willow Creek came into view gradually. First the church steeple, then the two-story buildings of Main Street, nestled in a valley between rolling hills. As they rode down the main thoroughfare, Rosalind kept her chin high despite feeling the weight of curious stares. A small farming community of just over 500 souls, Willow Creek had little to recommend it besides its strategic location along a relatively safe trail to the Black Hills. Still, it was the only home Rosalind had known for nearly a decade. They tied their horses outside the general store, a weathered clapboard building with a wooden porch running its length. "I need a few supplies," Rosalind explained, her voice low. "And Mrs. Holloway, the proprietor's wife, has a tendency to know everything happening in town." Kieran nodded, understanding her strategy. Information first, confrontation second. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. A plump woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun stood behind the counter, her eyes widening at the sight of Rosalind. "Mrs. Foster. Goodness, we'd thought you might have left town after the unfortunate incident." Her gaze shifted curiously to Kieran. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," Rosalind replied evenly. "I'm in need of some basic supplies. Flour, sugar, coffee, if you have it." As the older woman began gathering the items, her eyes kept darting to Kieran, who was examining a display of tools with apparent interest. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," Mrs. Holloway finally said, unable to contain her curiosity. "Kieran Anderson," he introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat. "Just passing through, offering a helping hand where needed." Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Is that so? Well, Mrs. Foster certainly could use some help, what with Vernon Watts ready to claim her property by month's end. Such a shame about that fire. Accidents do happen, though I must say, the timing was peculiar." Kieran leaned casually against the counter. "I heard something about that. Strange that a fire would start from the outside, with no lightning or such." Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between us, Mr. Winters, he's our volunteer fire marshal, said the same thing. Found traces of coal oil around the foundation, he did. But when he mentioned it to Sheriff Taylor, he was told to keep such thoughts to himself. Our sheriff and Mr. Watts being such close friends, you understand?" Rosalind's hands stilled on the flour sack she'd been examining. This was the first she'd heard of actual evidence of arson. "That is interesting," Kieran said, his tone casual though his eyes had sharpened. "I don't suppose Mr. Winters might be willing to put that observation in writing?" Mrs. Holloway looked scandalized. "Goodness, no. Not with his loan coming due next month. Vernon Watts isn't a man to cross, Mr. Anderson." "So I'm beginning to understand," Kieran replied. They paid for their supplies and stepped back onto the porch, Rosalind's mind racing with this new information. "That confirms your suspicions," Kieran said quietly. "But we'll need more than gossip to prove it." "Mr. Winters lives at the end of Pine Street," Rosalind told him, "but I doubt he'll speak to us after what Mrs. Holloway said." Kieran's smile turned slightly predatory. Let me worry about that. First, let's pay a visit to the bank. I want to see those loan documents myself. The Willow Creek Bank occupied the most impressive building in town, a two-story brick structure with large windows and ornate trim. Inside, the cool air smelled of polish and paper. A young clerk looked up as they entered, his expression turning wary when he recognized Rosalind. Mrs. Foster, how may I help you today? I'd like to speak with Mr. Watts regarding my husband's loans, Rosalind said, her voice steadier than she felt. The clerk hesitated. Mr. Watts is quite busy this morning. Tell him it concerns the Foster property and potential legal irregularities, Kieran interrupted smoothly. I'm sure he'll make time. The clerk's eyes widened slightly before he disappeared through a door behind the counter. Moments later, a portly man with a thick mustache and expensive suit emerged. Vernon Watts had the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed rich food and richer whiskey. Mrs. Foster, he said, his tone falsely solicitous. I was sorry to hear about your misfortune with the fire. These things do happen, especially in such remote locations. Rosalind felt Kieran stiffen beside her at the barely veiled implication. Mr. Watts, this is Kieran Anderson. He's helping me review my husband's financial arrangements with your bank. Watts's eyes flicked to Kieran, assessing. I wasn't aware you had engaged legal counsel, Mrs. Foster. Just a friend with knowledge of banking practices, Kieran replied evenly. We'd like to see the loan documents, please. I'm afraid those are confidential. Not from the widow of the borrower, Kieran countered. Especially when those loans involved property jointly owned by Mrs. Foster. Or are you suggesting Thomas Foster had sole ownership of the ranch? A flicker of unease crossed Watts's features. Of course not. But these matters are complex. Then let's simplify them, Kieran said. Show us the documents, or we'll be forced to involve the territorial authorities. I understand they take a dim view of banks that foreclose on property without proper documentation. The veiled threat hung in the air. After a tense moment, Watts gestured toward his office. Very well. Please, step this way. Inside the office, Watts retrieved a folder from a large safe behind his desk. He spread several documents across the polished surface. As you can see, everything is in order. Thomas Foster took out 3 loans against the property over the last 2 years. The terms are quite clear. Kieran examined each document carefully, his expression neutral. Rosalind watched him, trying to gauge what he was seeing. These are Thomas's signatures, she confirmed, pointing to the scrawled name at the bottom of each page. And this? Kieran asked, indicating another signature line that had been filled in with what appeared to be Rosalind's name. Her blood ran cold. That is not my signature. Watts frowned. Mrs. Foster, are you suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, Rosalind said, her voice tight. I'm stating a fact. I never signed these documents. I wasn't even aware of the second and third loans until after Thomas died. Kieran's finger tapped the paper. This is forgery, Mr. Watts. Plain and simple. Now see here, Watts blustered, his face reddening. Thomas Foster assured me his wife was aware of these transactions. If there was any irregularity, it was on his part, not the bank's. Did you witness Mrs. Foster signing these papers? Kieran pressed. Watts shifted uncomfortably. Well, no, but— Then the bank accepted forged documents which renders these loans invalid. Kieran gathered the papers. We'll be taking copies of these. You most certainly will not. Watts made to snatch the papers back, but Kieran was faster. We can do this the easy way, Mr. Watts, Kieran said, his voice deadly quiet. We take copies, investigate quietly, and come to some arrangement. Or we can involve the territorial marshal now and discuss not only forgery, but also the curious circumstances of the fire that conveniently occurred just as you were preparing to foreclose. Watts went still. Are you implying something, Mr. Anderson? I'm stating facts, Kieran replied. Just like Mrs. Foster. Now, shall we make those copies? Or shall I send a telegram to Marshal Davis in Yankton today? 10 minutes later, they walked out with copies of all 3 loan documents, Watts's face a mask of barely controlled fury behind them. That was... Rosalind searched for words as they untied their horses. Just the beginning, Kieran finished for her. We need to find Mr. Winters next, and then I think a conversation with Sheriff Taylor might be in order. As they mounted their horses, Rosalind caught sight of Watts watching them from the bank window, his expression murderous. He won't take this lying down, she warned. Kieran's eyes met hers, steady and sure. Neither will we. They found Abraham Winters repairing a fence behind his modest home. A wiry man with a face weathered by years outdoors, he straightened warily as they approached. Mrs. Foster, he acknowledged with a nod. His eyes moved to Kieran, questioning. Mr. Winters, this is Kieran Anderson, Rosalind introduced. We'd like to speak with you about the fire at my ranch. Winters immediately shook his head. I've said all I'm going to say about that. It was an accident, plain and simple. That's not what you told Mrs. Holloway, Kieran said quietly. You mentioned coal oil around the foundation. The older man's face tightened. Gossip and hearsay. I should know better than to run my mouth in this town. Mr. Winters, Rosalind stepped forward. I understand you're afraid. Vernon Watts holds influence here. But my home was destroyed, and I believe it was deliberate. All I'm asking is for the truth. Winters leaned on his shovel, conflict evident in his weathered features. Truth won't rebuild your home, Mrs. Foster, and it might cost me mine. What if we could guarantee your loan would be secure? Kieran asked. Winters gave a harsh laugh. And how would you manage that? We have evidence the bank has been operating fraudulently, Kieran explained. Evidence that could lead to serious consequences for Mr. Watts personally. Once that comes to light, I doubt the bank will be in any position to call in your loan. The older man studied them for a long moment. You really think you can stand against Watts? Many have tried. Few have succeeded. We have to try, Rosalind said simply. Please, Mr. Winters. You're a good man. I know you are. Winters sighed heavily, then gestured toward his house. Come inside. My wife's visiting her sister, so we can speak freely. Once seated at his kitchen table, Winters didn't mince words. It was arson, plain as day. Coal oil splashed around the north and east sides of the house, where the wind would carry the flames fastest. I found a broken lantern, too, like someone had used it to start the blaze, then tossed it aside. Did you tell Sheriff Taylor this? Kieran asked. I tried. Winters nodded grimly. He said I was seeing things that weren't there. Told me to write up my report as an accident, probably from a stove fire or such. When I pressed the matter, he reminded me of my loan situation, how unfortunate it would be if the bank called it due early. Would you be willing to put your original findings in writing now? Kieran asked. Winters hesitated. What good would it do? Combined with what we already have, it could be enough to bring in the territorial authorities, Kieran explained. This goes beyond simple fraud now. This is arson, possibly attempted murder if Rosalind had been inside. The fire marshal's eyes widened slightly at that perspective. After another moment's consideration, he nodded. I'll write it down, but you keep my name out of it as long as you can. We'll do our best, Rosalind promised. As they rode away from the Winters' home, Rosalind felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. What now? She asked. Now we see the sheriff, Kieran replied. Give him a chance to do the right thing, though I doubt he will. And then? Kieran's expression was determined. Then we send that telegram to Marshal Davis. But first, let's pay a visit to someone who might know more about Thomas's dealings with Watts. Who was his closest friend in town? Daniel Quinn. Rosalind answered without hesitation. They'd known each other since boyhood. Daniel owns the livery. The livery stable was busy when they arrived, with Daniel Quinn shoeing a massive draft horse. He looked up as they entered, his face registering surprise at the sight of Rosalind. Rosa, he said, using the nickname only old friends used. Wasn't expecting to see you in town. His eyes moved to Kieran, narrowing slightly. Hello, Daniel. Rosalind replied. This is Kieran Anderson. He's helping me with some matters concerning Thomas's debts and the fire. Daniel finished the last nail on the horse's shoe before standing and wiping his hands on his apron. Heard about the fire. Terrible business. That's partly what we wanted to talk to you about, Kieran said. Mrs. Foster believes it wasn't an accident. Daniel's expression remained carefully neutral. That's so. Daniel. Rosalind stepped closer. You were Thomas's closest friend. Did he ever mention problems with Vernon Watts? Beyond the loans, I mean. The blacksmith glanced around the stable before gesturing them toward a back room that served as his office. Once inside, with the door closed, his demeanor changed. Thomas was in deep, Rosa. Deeper than you know. He ran a hand over his balding head. It wasn't just the loans. He owed Watts personally from private card games, high-stakes affairs out at Watts's hunting lodge. Rosalind felt the blood drain from her face. How much? $5,000. The sum was staggering, more than their ranch had been worth even before the fire. There's more, Daniel continued reluctantly. A week before he was killed, Thomas came to me, scared like I'd never seen him. Said Watts had offered to forgive the gambling debt if Thomas would sign over the ranch outright. When Thomas refused, Watts supposedly threatened him. Threatened how? Kieran asked sharply. Said accidents happen all the time in mining towns. Daniel's eyes met Rosalind's. 3 days later, Thomas was dead in Deadwood, supposedly shot in a random saloon fight. Rosalind felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the edge of Daniel's desk. Are you saying Vernon Watts had my husband killed? Daniel shrugged helplessly. I'm saying Thomas thought it was possible. He gave me a letter, told me to give it to you if anything happened to him. His expression turned shamefaced. But after he died, Watts came to see me. Made it clear the letter should disappear if I wanted to keep my livery. I had my children to think of, Rosa. I'm sorry. The letter, Kieran said. Did you destroy it? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. Couldn't bring myself to. It's hidden in my home, under a floorboard in the bedroom. We need that letter, Kieran said. Today. Daniel looked torn, but after a moment he nodded. Meet me behind the church at sundown. I'll bring it then. As they left the livery, Rosalind felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Not only had her home been deliberately burned, but it seemed increasingly likely that Thomas's death hadn't been an accident either. We should go to the sheriff now, Kieran suggested, before word gets back to him that we've been asking questions. The sheriff's office was a small building next to the jailhouse. Inside, they found Sheriff Taylor at his desk, a lean man with a carefully trimmed mustache and cold eyes. He looked up as they entered, his gaze lingering on Rosalind before shifting to Kieran. Mrs. Foster, what can I do for you today? We'd like to discuss the fire at my ranch, Rosalind said, forcing strength into her voice. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. Unfortunate business, that. But as the report states, it was clearly an accident. Old buildings, dry timber happens all the time. We have reason to believe it was deliberately set, Kieran stated. Taylor's eyes narrowed. And you are? Kieran Anderson. I'm assisting Mrs. Foster with some legal matters. Well, Mr. Anderson, I don't know what reasons you think you have, but the fire marshal's report is quite clear, unless you have actual evidence. Like the coal oil found around the foundation? Rosalind interrupted. Or the broken lantern? The sheriff's expression hardened. I don't know where you're getting your information, But I suggest you be careful about spreading unfounded accusations. What about Thomas Foster's death? Kieran pressed. Have you ever considered it might not have been a random saloon shooting? Taylor stood abruptly. Now you're crossing a line. The Deadwood authorities investigated that matter thoroughly. It was a fair fight that ended badly. A convenient end for a man who refused to sell his ranch to Vernon Watts, Kieran observed. The sheriff's hand moved to rest near his holstered pistol. I think you two should leave now, and I'd advise you to stop stirring up trouble where there is none. Outside, Rosalind released a shaky breath. That went about as well as expected. He'll warn Watts, Kieran said grimly. We need to move faster than I thought. Let's get that letter from Daniel, then send a telegram to Marshal Davis immediately. What if Daniel doesn't show up? Rosalind worried. Then we'll have to make our case without it. But I think he will. He seemed genuinely remorseful about keeping it from you. They spent the remaining hours of the afternoon gathering additional supplies and information. Rosalind was surprised by how methodically Kieran worked, asking pointed questions of various townspeople about Watts's business practices and Thomas's final days. By the time the sun began to set, they had pieced together a disturbing picture. Vernon Watts had systematically pressured multiple property owners in the area, using both the bank's legitimate influence and more questionable methods. Several people hinted at accidents befalling those who refused his offers. As dusk fell, they made their way to the church, a simple white building on the edge of town. They waited behind it, watching as darkness settled over Willow Creek. He's late, Rosalind murmured after nearly an hour had passed. Kieran nodded, his expression troubled. Too late. Something's wrong. They decided to check Daniel's house, a modest dwelling a few streets over. As they approached, Rosalind noted with growing unease that no lights shone from the windows despite the darkness. Kieran knocked on the door. When no answer came, he tried the handle and found it unlocked, unusual for frontier homes, where security was a constant concern. Daniel, Rosalind called as they entered. The house was empty, but showed signs of a hasty departure, drawers left open, clothes scattered across beds. He's fled, Kieran said, surveying the scene, or was forced to leave. Rosalind moved toward the bedroom, remembering what Daniel had said about the hidden letter. He said it was under a floorboard. They searched the bedroom floor carefully, tapping boards until they found one that sounded hollow. Kieran pried it up with his knife, revealing a small space beneath. Inside lay a folded piece of paper. Rosalind's hands trembled as she unfolded her husband's last letter. My dearest Rosa, it began. If you're reading this, then my fears have been realized. Vernon Watts is not the respectable banker he pretends to be. He's been pressuring me to sell our ranch for months, offering to forgive my gambling debts in exchange. When I refused, believing I could find another way to repay what I owe, he threatened that accidents happen. I'm going to Deadwood to try to win enough to clear my debt and free us from his influence. If I don't return, know that Watts is dangerous and will stop at nothing to get our land. There's a reason he wants it so badly. I've discovered there's a rich silver deposit in the North Ridge. I had samples tested secretly in Yankton. Our land is worth far more than anyone knows. Be careful, my love. I'm sorry for the mess I've made of things. Thomas. Rosalind sank onto the bed, the letter clutched in her hand. Silver, she whispered. All this time. That explains Watts's persistence, Kieran said, his expression grim. And possibly why he resorted to such extreme measures. A noise outside the window caught their attention, the sound of approaching horses. We need to go, Kieran said urgently. Now. They slipped out the back door just as riders approached the front of the house. Keeping to the shadows, they made their way to where they'd left their horses at the livery. We need to send that telegram tonight, Kieran insisted. With this letter, we have enough to bring in the territorial authorities. The telegraph office was closed for the night, but the operator, Harold Jenkins, lived in rooms above. Kieran pounded on the side door until a disheveled Jenkins appeared. "I need to send an urgent telegram," Kieran said, pressing a gold coin into the man's hand. "It's a matter of life and death." The bribe was enough to convince Jenkins, who led them upstairs to his equipment. Kieran quickly composed a message to Marshal Davis in Yankton, detailing their evidence of fraud, arson, and possible murder, emphasizing the need for immediate intervention. As the telegraph key clicked out the message, Rosalind watched the street below through a small window. "Riders," she said suddenly. "Coming this way. 4 of them." Kieran moved to her side. In the moonlight, they could make out Sheriff Taylor and 3 men approaching the telegraph office. "He must have guessed what we'd do," Kieran muttered. "Jenkins, is that message sent?" The operator nodded. "Just finished. Marshal Davis should receive it within the hour." "Is there a back way out of here?" Rosalind asked urgently. Jenkins pointed to a narrow staircase. "Leads to the alley, but your horses are out front." "We'll have to leave them," Kieran decided. "We need to get out of town now. Can we borrow a horse from you?" Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "Take my mare. She's in the small stable behind the building. But you didn't get her from me." They descended the back stairs as they heard pounding on the front door of the telegraph office. In the small stable, they found Jenkins's mare, a sturdy brown horse that looked fast enough for their needs. "Both of us on one horse will slow us down," Rosalind worried. "We don't have a choice," Kieran replied, helping her mount before swinging up behind her. They rode out of town via back alleys, avoiding the main streets where the sheriff and his men were searching. Once beyond the town limits, they pushed the horse as fast as they dared in the darkness, heading toward Rosalind's ranch. "They'll look for us there," she said over her shoulder. "We won't stay," Kieran assured her. "Just long enough to gather whatever supplies we can, then head north toward the territorial capital. We need to reach Marshal Davis before Watts figures out a way to discredit our message." The night was clear and cool as they rode, the stars providing enough light to navigate by. Rosalind was acutely aware of Kieran's arms around her, his body solid and warm against her back. Despite the danger, she felt an unexpected sense of security in his presence. They reached the ranch shortly after midnight, the burned-out shell of the house a stark silhouette against the night sky. Moving quickly, they gathered what supplies they could from the stable food: blankets, Kieran's saddlebags. They transferred everything to a pack saddle on Thomas's gelding, which Kieran would ride. Rosalind took Penny, her mare. "We should reach Oak Ridge by tomorrow afternoon," Kieran said as they prepared to leave. "We can send another telegram to Marshal Davis from there, confirming we're on our way to Yankton." As they mounted their horses, Rosalind cast a final glance at the ruins of her home. "I never thought I'd be fleeing from here like a criminal." "You're not the criminal," Kieran reminded her. "And we'll be back. That's a promise." They rode north through the night, keeping to less traveled trails. When dawn broke, they stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold breakfast. "Tell me about the silver," Kieran said as they sat on a fallen log, chewing on jerky and hard biscuits. "Did you have any idea it was there?" Rosalind shook her head. "None. Thomas never mentioned it until that letter. The North Ridge was always just rocky grazing land to me." "If it's as rich as Thomas believed, it could be worth a small fortune," Kieran mused. "Enough to rebuild your ranch several times over." "If we can prove it's rightfully mine," Rosalind said. "After everything that's happened, I'm not sure that will be easy." Kieran's eyes met hers, steady and reassuring. "We have Thomas's letter. We have evidence of forged loan documents. And we have Abraham Winters's testimony about the arson, assuming we can find him again. It's enough to start with." Rosalind studied him, the question that had been nagging at her finally spilling out. "Why are you doing all this, Kieran? The truth this time." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Finally, he sighed. 5 years ago, I was a lawyer in St. Louis. I specialized in banking law. I discovered one of my firm's clients, a powerful bank, was systematically defrauding homesteaders and small farmers out of their land. When I tried to expose it, they framed me for embezzlement. Rosalind's eyes widened. Were you convicted? No, he said grimly. But by the time I cleared my name, my reputation was ruined, my fiancé had left me, and the bank had successfully buried the evidence of their fraud. I've been traveling west ever since, looking for, I don't know, redemption, maybe. A chance to fight the same battle but win this time. And then you found me, Rosalind said softly. His eyes met hers. I found someone who deserved justice. Someone who'd been wronged by the same kind of men who destroyed my life. Helping you felt right. The vulnerability in his admission touched something in Rosalind that she'd thought long buried the capacity to trust. She reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. Thank you for being my fool then. His fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. Best foolish decision I've ever made. They continued their journey, riding through the morning and into the afternoon. The landscape changed gradually, the rolling prairie giving way to more wooded areas as they approached Oak Ridge, a town larger than Willow Creek, and less likely to be under Vernon Watts's influence. They reached Oak Ridge by late afternoon, tired and saddle-sore but relieved to have made it without incident. Their first stop was the telegraph office, where Kieran sent a message to Marshal Davis confirming they were en route to Yankton with additional evidence. We should rest here tonight, Kieran suggested as they left the telegraph office. The horses need it, and so do we. We'll continue to Yankton in the morning. They found a small hotel on the outskirts of town, less conspicuous than the larger establishment on the main street. Rosalind waited with the horses while Kieran secured 2 rooms. Only one available, he reported when he returned. But it has 2 beds. Rosalind nodded, too exhausted to feel uncomfortable about the arrangement. After stabling their horses, they made their way to the room, a simple space with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the street. You take the bed furthest from the door, Kieran instructed. I'll keep watch for the first part of the night, then wake you for your turn. Rosalind didn't argue, though the idea of Kieran watching over her sleep stirred emotions she wasn't ready to examine. She washed her face and hands in the basin, then sat on the edge of the bed to remove her boots. Do you really think we can win against Watts? She asked, the question that had been haunting her finally voiced. Kieran, who had been checking his revolver, looked up. I think we have truth on our side, and evidence. It won't be easy, but yes, I believe we can win. And if we do, what then? The question held layers of meaning, even to her own ears. He set the gun aside and met her gaze directly. That would depend on what you want, Rosalind. The way he said her name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. I want my land back, she said. I want to rebuild. Beyond that, she trailed off, uncertain. Beyond that is for later, he said gently. Get some rest. We've got a long ride tomorrow. Rosalind nodded and lay down, not bothering to undress further. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive as her mind raced with all that had happened and with the man sitting vigilant across the room. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to Kieran's hand on her shoulder. Riders, he whispered. 6 of them, just arrived in town. Sheriff Taylor is among them. Rosalind sat up, instantly alert. How did they find us so quickly? They must have guessed we'd head for Oak Ridge. It's the logical stop on the way to Yankton. Kieran was already gathering their few belongings. We need to leave. Now. They slipped out through the back of the hotel, keeping to the shadows as they made their way to the stable. The night was cloudy, providing extra cover as they saddled their horses as quietly as possible. Where do we go? Rosalind asked as they led the horses out the back of the stable. If they've guessed we're heading to Yankton, they'll watch all the main roads. Kieran considered for a moment. There's a smaller settlement about 15 miles east of here, Cooperton. We can head there, then cut north toward Yankton. It's longer, but less predictable. They mounted and rode out of town via a narrow trail that skirted the eastern edge. Once they were well clear of Oak Ridge, they urged their horses to a faster pace, though the cloudy night made navigation challenging. They rode in silence for several hours. The only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. Rosalind found herself drawing strength from Kieran's presence beside her, his silhouette a reassuring shadow in the darkness. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they heard the distant sound of pursuit horses riding hard behind them. "They've picked up our trail," Kieran said grimly. "We need to find somewhere to hide until they pass." Rosalind scanned the landscape. "There." She pointed to a densely wooded area to their right. "We can lose them in there." They urged their tired horses into the trees, following a narrow game trail that wound deeper into the woods. The undergrowth became thicker, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses. "Here," Kieran said, indicating a small clearing surrounded by dense brush. "The horses can rest, and will be hidden from the trail." They settled in to wait, listening intently. Within half an hour, they heard riders passing nearby moving fast, but not stopping to search the woods. "They're heading toward Cooperton," Rosalind observed. "They must think we're trying to reach it before them." Kieran nodded. "Which gives us a chance. Once they're well past, we'll cut north directly toward Yankton. Cross-country will be slower, but safer." They waited another hour to ensure the pursuit had truly passed before continuing their journey. The day grew warm as they rode, the summer sun beating down on them. By midday, they were both exhausted, their horses showing signs of fatigue. "We need to rest," Kieran finally said, as they reached a small stream. "Just an hour or two. Enough for the horses to recover and for us to eat something." They dismounted in a shady spot by the water, allowing the horses to drink and graze. Rosalind sank to the ground, her muscles aching from the long hours in the saddle. "Here," Kieran handed her jerky and a biscuit from their dwindling supplies. "Not much of a meal, but it'll keep us going." As they ate, Rosalind found herself studying him, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the capable hands that had done so much to help her in such a short time. "What will you do after this is over?" she asked suddenly. "Go back to practicing law?" Kieran considered the question. "I don't know. I've been wandering for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." His eyes met hers. "What about you? If we recover your land, will you stay and rebuild alone?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. "I've been alone for a long time," Rosalind said slowly. "Even when I was married, Thomas was distant. Edward before him was kind, but we married young, out of practical necessity more than deep feeling." She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything but alone anymore." "Maybe you just haven't had the right reason to try," Kieran suggested, his voice gentle. Before she could respond, a twig snapped nearby. Both of them tensed, reaching for their weapons. Kieran motioned for her to stay put as he rose silently to investigate. Moments later, he returned, his expression relieved. "Just a deer, but we should move on. We've been here long enough." They continued their journey north, the terrain growing more challenging as they maintained their cross-country route. By nightfall, they had made good progress, but both were nearly dead on their feet. "We need proper rest," Kieran admitted as they made camp in a sheltered hollow. "We'll be no good to anyone if we collapse before reaching Yankton." They built a small fire, careful to keep it low to avoid attracting attention. After a meager dinner of the last of their supplies, they spread their blankets near the fire. "I'll take first watch again," Kieran offered. Rosalind shook her head. "You barely slept last night. I'll watch first." He looked like he wanted to argue but was too exhausted. "Wake me in 4 hours then." She nodded, settling herself against a tree trunk as Kieran lay down on his blanket. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. Rosalind watched him in the firelight, allowing herself to acknowledge what she had been fighting since he first rode up to her burned-out ranch. She was falling for this man, who had risked everything to help her. It was foolish. Perhaps the most foolish thing she could do after all she'd been through. And yet, there it was, a warmth in her chest whenever he was near, a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in years, if ever. The night passed quietly. When it came time to wake Kieran, she found herself reluctant to disturb his sleep, but knew they both needed rest. She gently touched his shoulder. He woke instantly, his hand going to his gun before he registered her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "All quiet," she assured him. "Your turn to rest." As they traded places, their hands brushed, and Rosalind felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. She lay down on her blanket, the spot where Kieran had been still warm. "Rosalind." His voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes," she replied, turning to look at him. In the dying firelight, his expression was earnest. "Whatever happens in Yankton, I want you to know I'm glad I found you. Or that you found me. However it happened." She smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange on her face after so many months of grief and worry. "I'm glad too, Kieran. Now let me sleep before I say something truly foolish." His quiet chuckle followed her into dreams that, for once, held hope instead of fear. They reached Yankton late the next day, the territorial capital a welcome sight after their arduous journey. The town was significantly larger than either Willow Creek or Oak Ridge, with brick buildings, proper sidewalks, and a bustling main street that spoke of prosperity. "The marshal's office will be near the courthouse," Kieran said as they rode into town, both of them alert for any sign of Taylor or his men. They found the territorial marshal's office a substantial building with the Dakota Territory seal displayed prominently on the door. Inside, they were greeted by a deputy who eyed their trail-worn appearance with suspicion. "We need to see Marshal Davis," Kieran said. "It's urgent. He should have received our telegrams." The deputy's eyebrows rose. "You're Anderson and Foster? Marshall's been waiting for you. Said to bring you straight to him when you arrived." He led them to a back office where Marshal Davis, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, rose to greet them. "Mrs. Foster." "Mr. Anderson, your telegrams have caused quite a stir." He gestured to chairs. "Sit down and tell me everything, from the beginning." For the next hour, they laid out their case, the forged loan documents, Thomas's letter about the silver deposit, Abraham Winters's evidence of arson, and the pursuit that had followed them from Willow Creek to Yankton. Davis listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "These are serious accusations against prominent men," he said finally, "but you've brought solid evidence, enough that I can initiate a formal investigation." He tapped Thomas's letter. "This, particularly, is compelling. If verified, it establishes motive for both the arson and, potentially, your husband's death." "What happens now?" Rosalind asked. "Now, you both stay in Yankton under my protection, while I send deputies to Willow Creek to investigate and bring in Watts and Taylor for questioning. I'll also send someone to look for your fire marshal, Winters." Davis stood. "I've arranged rooms for you at the hotel across the street. Get some rest. This investigation may take time." As they left the marshal's office, Rosalind felt a curious mix of relief and anxiety. "Do you think it will work?" she asked Kieran as they crossed the street to the hotel. "Davis seems competent and honest," Kieran replied. "That's more than half the battle. The evidence is strong, especially with Thomas's letter. I believe we have a good chance." The hotel was modest but clean, a welcome luxury after days on the trail. This time, they were given separate rooms adjacent to each other, with a connecting door for safety, as the marshal had arranged. "Get some proper rest," Kieran advised as they parted at Rosalind's door. "You've been through more than anyone should have to endure." She caught his hand before he could turn away. "Kieran, thank you. For everything." His fingers tightened around hers. "No thanks needed, Rosalind. I told you being your fool has been the best decision I've made in a long time." That night, Rosalind slept deeply for the first time in months, secure in the knowledge that justice might finally be within reach, and that Kieran Anderson was just on the other side of the connecting door. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Marshal Davis moved quickly, sending deputies to Willow Creek who returned with both Vernon Watts and Sheriff Taylor in custody. Abraham Winters was located in a neighboring settlement, having fled there with his family when Daniel Quinn disappeared. Rosalind and Kieran were called to provide formal statements multiple times, recounting their evidence in detail. Each night they would meet for dinner, discussing the day's developments and what might come next. On the 8th day, Marshal Davis called them to his office, his expression more grave than usual. "We've found Daniel Quinn," he said without preamble. "Or rather, what's left of him." His body was discovered in an abandoned mine shaft 10 miles from Willow Creek. Rosalind gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Daniel." "Murdered?" Kieran asked, though the answer seemed obvious. Davis nodded. "Shot in the back. We believe he was killed the night you went to his house for the letter." "Because he was going to help us," Rosalind whispered, guilt washing over her. "This isn't your fault," Kieran said firmly, taking her hand. "It's on Watts and Taylor." "And we now have enough evidence to charge them both," Davis confirmed. "Watts with fraud, arson, and ordering Quinn's murder. Taylor as an accomplice. We're also reopening the investigation into your husband's death in Deadwood." "What about my land?" Rosalind asked, focusing on the practical to avoid being overwhelmed by grief for Daniel. "The territorial judge has issued a temporary stay on any foreclosure proceedings," Davis explained. "Once Watts is convicted, which I believe is all but certain, given the evidence the fraudulent loans will be invalidated. The land will remain yours." "And the silver deposit?" Kieran inquired. "I've dispatched a mining expert to examine the North Ridge," Davis said. "If the deposit is as valuable as your husband believed, Mrs. Foster, you'll be a wealthy woman." The news should have been cause for celebration, but Rosalind found herself subdued as they left the marshal's office. The cost had been too high, Thomas, Daniel, and who knew how many others whose accidents had never been questioned. "You're thinking about Daniel," Kieran observed as they walked slowly back toward the hotel. "And Thomas," she admitted, "and wondering if any of this is worth it." "You can't blame yourself for their choices," Kieran said gently. "Thomas chose to gamble. Daniel chose to help you, knowing the risks." "And you?" she asked, stopping to face him. "What did you choose, Kieran?" His eyes held hers steadily. "I chose to help someone I believed in, someone who deserved better than what life had handed her." He paused, then added softly, "Someone I've come to care for more than I thought possible." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. "The town was right, you know," Rosalind said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am a fool, because despite everything, despite all the reasons I have not to trust, I find myself trusting you completely." Kieran's hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Then we're both fools, and I wouldn't have it any other way." In that moment, on a busy Yankton street, with justice finally within their grasp, Rosalind made her choice. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of trust despite all reason, of foolish hearts finding each other against impossible odds. When they finally parted, Kieran's smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. I think, he said, his voice rough with emotion, that this might be the beginning of the best foolishness of our lives. Rosalind laughed a sound of genuine joy that surprised even her. I believe you may be right, Mr. Anderson. 3 months later, Rosalind stood on the porch of her newly rebuilt ranch house, watching as the autumn sun cast golden light across the prairie. Vernon Watts and Sheriff Taylor had been convicted on all charges, with Watts additionally charged for arranging Thomas's murder once the Deadwood investigation was completed. The silver deposit in the North Ridge had proven even richer than Thomas had believed. The mining rights alone had provided Rosalind with enough money to rebuild the ranch better than before, with a fine new house, a large barn, and improved fencing for expanded cattle operations. But the greatest change in her life stood beside her now, Kieran Anderson, no longer a wandering ex-lawyer, but her husband of 2 weeks. After the trials concluded, he had asked her to marry him, promising to be the foolish optimist to her cautious pragmatism for as long as they both lived. The townspeople of Willow Creek had been predictably scandalized by the rapid courtship, once again calling Rosalind a fool for trusting her heart so soon. But this time, the whispers held less power to hurt her. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, slipping an arm around her waist as they watched the sunset. "About how sometimes the greatest wisdom looks like foolishness to others," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "About how the best decisions I've ever made have been the ones that terrified me the most." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Like marrying a penniless drifter with a questionable past?" She laughed, turning in his arms to face him. "Like recognizing a good man when fate dropped him at my doorstep. Like allowing myself to trust again when everyone, including myself, thought I was beyond it." "Well, Mrs. Anderson," he murmured, drawing her closer, "I, for one, am eternally grateful for your particular brand of foolishness." As his lips met hers, Rosalind reflected that the path that had led them here through grief and betrayal, danger and justice had been worth every step. They were both fools, perhaps, but fools who had found in each other something worth believing in, something worth fighting for, something true. And in the end, wasn't that the wisest choice of all?